Story number one. In the wilds of northern British Columbia, the silence isn't just absence of sound, it's alive, ancient, and watchful. It wraps around you like a shroud, whispering of secrets buried deep in the forest. For Ethan and Mark, two brothers on the cusp of adulthood. That silence was both a promise and a warning as they embarked on a summer road trip in the mid-1990s, chasing freedom on the open road. But on the third night, as dusk bled into darkness on Highway 37, they would learn that some roads lead to places you can never leave. 5 figures emerged from the shadows, their eyes gleaming with a hunger that wasn't entirely human. This is the story of 2 brothers who stopped at the wrong place, at the wrong time, and found themselves staring into the face of something that should not exist. The forest along Highway 37 stretched endless and unyielding, its pines clawing at the sky like skeletal hands. Ethan, 18, drove with the confidence of youth, his eyes bright with the thrill of independence. Mark, 16, sat in the passenger seat, sketching the passing scenery in a worn notebook, trusting his older brother to lead the way. Their journey began with the kind of excitement that only youth and a full tank of gas can bring. They'd planned a route from their small hometown in southern British Columbia to the rugged coast of Prince Rupert, a path through mountains and lakes that promised adventure. Their parents, a little nervous but supportive, had insisted on daily phone calls and pressed emergency cash into their hands. The brothers had laughed, dismissing the warnings as parental overreach. The first 2 days were a dream: campfires under starlit skies, greasy diner burgers, and the hum of their old sedan carrying them deeper into the wilderness. But by the 3rd day, the mood shifted. The highway was a ribbon of cracked asphalt winding through endless trees. The sun sank low, painting the forest in shades of blood and shadow. Mark watched the gas gauge dip lower and lower, his anxiety rising with every passing mile. Ethan, ever the optimist, promised a gas station or rest stop was just ahead, but as the sun bled out behind the trees, it became clear they were alone. The road was desolate. No cars, no lights. Just the endless march of trees. Mark's fingers tightened on his sketchbook, his drawings growing darker, more jagged. Ethan's reassurances began to sound hollow, even to himself, when they finally spotted a gravel pull-off, half hidden by overgrown brush. It felt like a relief. They pulled in, parking far from the road, the sedan's engine falling silent. The silence that followed was immediate and total. They ate a cold dinner of sandwiches on the hood, the forest swallowing the last of the daylight. Mark tried to call home, but his phone displayed only a single bar before flickering to no service. He kept it to himself, not wanting to worry Ethan. They locked the doors and settled in. Mark in his sleeping bag, Ethan reclining the driver's seat. Mark curled up in his sleeping bag, listening to the forest breathe around them. The darkness was oppressive, the kind that pressed against the windows, as if the forest itself was watching. Mark tried to sleep, focusing on Ethan's steady breathing, but his mind conjured images of unseen eyes peering from the trees. Ethan, too, felt the weight of the silence. Though he wouldn't admit it, the forest seemed to hum with a presence, something ancient and patient, waiting just beyond the headlight's reach. Mark woke with a start, heart pounding, unsure what had roused him. The car was cold, the windows fogged with their breath. For a moment, he lay still, listening. Then he heard it. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching on the gravel outside. He held his breath, straining to see through the condensation. At first, there was nothing but the faint outlines of trees. Then a shadow moved, tall and upright, too purposeful to be an animal. He reached over and shook Ethan's shoulder, whispering his name. Ethan stirred, groggy, but Mark's trembling hand silenced him. The footsteps came again, louder this time, circling the car. Ethan's eyes widened, his breath catching. He reached for the keys, but in the darkness and panic, fumbled them onto the floor. A face pressed against the driver's window, so close the brothers could see the deep lines in the man's skin. His eyes, wild and glinting. The man grinned, revealing yellowed teeth, and pressed his hand flat against the glass. Another figure appeared at the rear window, then another at the passenger side. Mark counted 5 in total, their ragged clothes hanging loosely on gaunt frames, their faces hollow and predatory. One of them tried the passenger door, rattling the handle. Another tapped the glass with a metallic object, a knife, its edge catching the faint moonlight. The men moved with a strange, predatory patience, as if they were used to waiting for prey to make a mistake. Ethan scrambled for the keys, his hands shaking. He jammed them into the ignition and turned. The engine coughed, then roared, the headlights flooding the pull-off with light. For a split second, they froze, caught in the glare like startled animals. Then they moved, hands pounding on the windows, faces pressed close, their eyes gleaming with something beyond hunger, something ancient, something wrong. Ethan slammed the car into drive and floored the accelerator. The tires spun, then caught, the sedan lurching forward. The car lurched forward, narrowly missing one of the men who stumbled back. Mark glanced back as they hit the highway. The figures standing at the edge of the pull-off, their faces unreadable in the darkness. They drove for miles in silence. The only sound the roar of the engine and their own ragged breathing. Ethan's knuckles were white on the wheel, his jaw set. Mark stared out the window, half expecting to see those faces in the trees, their eyes tracking the car. When they finally reached a truck stop bathed in harsh fluorescent light, they pulled in and sat for a long time, neither willing to get out. The neon glow of the truck stop felt like salvation, but the fear clung to them, heavy and unshakable. Eventually, Ethan managed to call their parents, inventing a story about car trouble. They didn't speak of the men, not to their parents, not to each other. It felt unreal, like a nightmare they'd shared. They spent the night in shifts, one always watching the parking lot. Ethan tried to laugh it off, but Mark could see the fear lingering in his eyes. For the rest of the trip, they avoided remote pull-offs, sticking to crowded gas stations and main highways, even if it meant hours of detours. The memory of those faces pressed against the glass haunted them both when they finally made it home. Back in their small town, the brothers tried to move on, but the night had changed them. Mark would wake up gasping, certain he could hear footsteps outside his window. Ethan grew quieter, his easy smile replaced by a shadow of guilt for stopping at that pull-off. Years passed, but the memory lingered like a wound that wouldn't heal. Ethan grew distant, haunted by guilt. He blamed himself for putting Mark in danger, for trusting the road too much. The brothers grew up, went to college, started families of their own, but the memory never faded. Mark became obsessed with the wilderness, reading about disappearances along remote highways. He found stories of cars abandoned with doors open, of travelers who vanished without a trace. Years later, Mark found himself driving that same stretch of highway, unable to resist the pull of the past. The pull-off was still there, overgrown with weeds, silent and empty. He parked for a moment, engine idling, and tried to make sense of what had happened all those years ago. The forest loomed, its silence as heavy as ever, and Mark felt it watching him, waiting. He asked around at local diners and gas stations, hoping for answers. Most locals shrugged, uninterested. But one old-timer, a trucker with a face like worn leather, leaned in close and whispered, "You're lucky, kid. There's things in those woods that don't want to be found. People go missing out here all the time. Best not to ask too many questions." The words sent a chill through Mark, echoing the fear of that night. Back home, he and Ethan talked about that night for the first time in years. Ethan recalled the deliberate way the men moved, unhurried, unafraid. Mark remembered the cold, dead look in their eyes. They both felt the helplessness, the certainty that they'd been alone against something they couldn't understand. The story became a cautionary tale in their family. They taught their children to lock doors, to avoid dark roads, to trust their instincts. The fear became a part of them, a shadow that followed them through life. They locked their doors religiously, even in the safest neighborhoods. Mark's obsession with true crime grew, his shelves filled with books on unsolved cases. He wondered how many others had encountered the men in the night and how many hadn't been as lucky. Ethan sought therapy, trying to unravel the guilt and fear, but the nightmares persisted. Their parents eventually learned the truth, pieced together from fragments overheard in late-night conversations. Their mother wept, their father grew silent. The incident became a ghost in the family, haunting holidays and reunions. The brothers drifted apart, their shared trauma a wall between them. But the bond forged that night remained, unspoken but unbreakable. The wilderness remained vast and indifferent. Highway 37 still wound through the same forests, its silence as deep and menacing as ever. Mark sometimes wondered if those men, or whatever they were, still waited in the shadows, patient and hungry. He never found out who they were or what they wanted. The uncertainty was its own horror. A question without an answer. In the end, the story of the men in the night became a legend in Mark's mind. A warning to anyone who would listen. He told his children, his friends, anyone who'd listen, trust your instincts, lock your doors, never underestimate the darkness. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, he'd stare out his window, searching the shadows, wondering if the forest was still watching, waiting for its next guest. Story number 2. I thought the open road would set us free. My name is Sunita Patel, and that summer, my husband Raj and I packed our minivan with snacks, playlists, and our 2 kids, Arjun and Priya, for a cross-country trip from Vancouver to Toronto. It was meant to be a celebration, a chance to stitch memories into our family's story. But some roads don't lead to freedom, some roads lead to fear. We were halfway through Saskatchewan when I first felt it, a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was watching. We pulled into a dusty gas station just outside Swift Current, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and wild grass. The sun burned high, but the light felt wrong, too harsh, casting shadows that seemed to linger too long. Raj filled the tank while I took the kids inside for drinks. That's when I saw him, standing by the magazine rack. His eyes locked on me. He was unremarkable, average height, thinning hair, faded blue jacket, but his stare was unrelenting, unblinking, like he was studying me. I hurried Arjun and Priya out, my chest tight with a fear I couldn't name. I whispered to Raj about the man, but he brushed it off. People stare, especially in small towns. Don't worry, I wanted to believe him, but my instincts screamed otherwise. We piled back into the van, the kids bickering over the last bag of chips, and pulled onto the highway. Then I saw it in the rearview mirror, a battered silver sedan, easing out of the gas station, falling in behind us. At first, I told myself it was nothing. There weren't many roads out here, and it was natural for another car to head east, but the sedan stayed with us, mile after mile, never too close, never passing, always there. I tried to focus on the music, on Priya's giggles, on Raj's steady hands on the wheel, but every glance in the mirror showed that car. its headlights like eyes in the gathering dusk. It wasn't a coincidence, it was a shadow, and it was hunting us. By the time we stopped for lunch in Moose Jaw, my nerves were frayed. The sedan pulled into the parking lot minutes later. The man sitting inside, hands on the wheel, staring straight ahead. I watched him through the restaurant window, my burger untouched, my heart pounding. Raj grew tense, his voice sharp as he said, "Let's get back on the road." We tried to lose him, taking an unexpected exit, looping through a small town. But when we rejoined the highway, the sedan was there, waiting. The kids were restless, their voices a hum in the back seat as the prairies stretched endlessly around us. Arjun asked if everything was okay, and I forced a smile, telling him not to worry, but my hands shook as I adjusted the air conditioning. Raj's knuckles were white on the wheel, his jaw tight. We drove on. The sedan a constant presence, its driver a mystery. Why us? What did he want? I scanned the horizon for answers, but all I saw were fields, flat and lifeless, under a sky that felt too big. We tried calling the police, but the signal was weak, dropping in and out. When we reached a dispatcher, they said, "Unless he's threatening you or breaking the law, there's not much we can do. Stay in populated areas." Populated areas? There was nothing out here but fields and the occasional farmhouse. Their windows dark, their yards empty. The sedan's headlights glowed behind us as the sun sank, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for the van. I felt trapped, like a deer caught in a hunter's sight. Night fell, and the fear grew heavier. The kids fell asleep, curled up in the back, unaware of the danger. Every sound was magnified, the hum of the tires, the creak of the van, Raj's shallow breaths. I whispered to him, "What does he want?" He shook his head, his voice barely audible. "I don't know, Sunita. We can't stop." The sedan's lights were relentless. Twin beacons in the darkness, pacing us mile after mile. We tried a rest area, hoping other travelers would scare him off. The sedan pulled in, parking at the far end of the lot, the man motionless inside. I stared at him through the mirror, my pulse racing, willing him to leave. Raj kept the engine idling, his eyes flicking between the road and the man. After 10 agonizing minutes, we pulled out. The sedan followed. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but the man's silence was louder than any words. In a small town, we hit a stoplight. I rolled down my window and shouted, asking why he was following us. He didn't flinch, didn't look at me, just stared ahead like I didn't exist. The light turned green, and we sped off. The sedan still there, a ghost that wouldn't let go. I felt like I was losing my mind, the highway blurring into a nightmare. The kids stirred, Priya mumbling about being home, and I fought to keep my voice steady, to keep them safe from my fear. Hours dragged on, exhaustion sinking into our bones. By midnight, we were breaking. My hands trembled, Raj's eyes were bloodshot, and the kids' questions grew quieter. Sensing the weight of our silence, then we saw it, a truck stop, its lights cutting through the dark like a lifeline. Raj parked close to the entrance, the lot bustling with semis and travelers. The sedan circled slowly, the man's face hidden in shadow. For a moment, I thought he'd follow us inside, but he drove back onto the highway and vanished. We sat in silence, relief washing over us. I kept watching the road, expecting those headlights to return, but they didn't. We went inside, the noise of the truck stop wrapping around us like a shield. The rest of the trip passed without incident, but the memory haunted us. I woke at night, certain I saw headlights outside our home. Raj became hypervigilant, always checking the mirrors. The kids grew up, but that night became a story we told. a warning etched into our family. Years later, I found a photo in Arjun's old sketchbook, tucked away in a box of childhood things. It was a drawing he'd done after the trip, a crude sketch of a silver car, its headlights glowing, a faceless man at the wheel. I hadn't known he'd seen the sedan so clearly, that it had marked him too. I called him, my voice shaking, and he told me about a night drive, years later, when a car followed him for miles before passing. "I was fine, Mum," he said. "But I remembered, that trip changed us. We avoided road trips, sticking to flights or staying close to home. The open road, once a dream, now felt like a trap. I started noticing things, cars that lingered too long, shadows that moved wrong. Once, at a gas station, I saw a man in a faded jacket, and my heart stopped until I saw his face. Different, ordinary, but the fear never left. The worst came months later. A letter arrived, no return address, postmarked from Swift Current. Inside was a single sentence: "You were fun to follow." No signature. Just those words in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. I burned it, but the words stayed, carved into my mind. Who was he? Why us? I'll never know. But I check my mirrors every time I drive, waiting for those headlights to return. But some shadows never leave you. Shadows. Story number 3. The open road stretched endlessly before Emily and Sarah's little blue hatchback, its tires humming over the sun-scorched asphalt of a Kansas 2-lane highway. The two friends, both 20, were chasing adventure, their laughter mingling with the wind whipping through open windows. They were full of restless energy and the kind of optimism that comes from never having been truly afraid. But as the gas gauge dipped dangerously low, a shadow crept over their carefree journey. The engine sputtered and died, the car coasting to a stop at the side of a narrow, 2-lane road. The golden fields of corn and wheat swayed silently around them, the horizon empty except for a distant farmhouse, too far to reach on foot. Emily and Sarah sat in silence, the reality of their situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Emily frowned at the dashboard, her voice tight with worry. "We should have filled up at the last town," she said, her confidence crumbling as the needle rested on empty. Sarah's phone was useless, the signal swallowed by the vastness of the Midwest. They got out, stretching their legs and scanning the horizon. The road was a ribbon of grey, untouched by traffic, the only movement the ripple of crops in the breeze. An hour passed, the sun dipping low, painting the sky in hues of amber and violet. Fear began to gnaw at Emily's gut. They couldn't stay here, exposed as night closed in. Then, a battered white van appeared, its shape growing larger against the fading light. Emily's heart lifted. Help, at last. The van slowed, pulling onto the shoulder with a crunch of gravel. The driver's window rolled down, and a man in his late 30s leaned out, grinning. "Car trouble?" he asked, his voice warm, almost too friendly. Emily explained their situation, and the man nodded sympathetically. "Happens out here," he said. "I can take you to Harper. Gas station's there. I'll even bring you back." Relief washed over Emily, but a flicker of doubt lingered in her chest, like a warning she couldn't quite hear. The man seemed friendly enough, clean-shaven, jeans, a faded t-shirt, a wedding ring glinting on his finger, but his eyes held something else, a glint that didn't match his smile. Emily hesitated, glancing at Sarah. The sky was darkening, the fields growing shadowy, and the thought of walking miles alone felt like a trap of its own. "Okay," she said finally. "Thank you. That's really kind." The man slid open the van's side door, revealing a barren interior. The floor lined with stained carpet. 2 other men sat in the back, their faces unreadable, their silence heavy. Emily's unease deepened, but she forced herself to smile. Sarah, ever the bolder of the 2, shrugged and climbed inside. Emily followed, her pulse racing as she stepped into the van's dim interior. The van smelled of sweat and old cigarettes. The door slid shut behind them, the sound sharp and final. Emily sat as close to Sarah as possible, clutching her purse in her lap. The engine roared to life, and the van lurched forward, carrying them into the unknown. The men in the back watched them, silent, their eyes like predators, sizing up prey. The van rattled along the narrow road, the hum of the engine filling the tense silence. Emily's fingers tightened around her purse, her eyes darting between the men and the window. The fields outside were endless, the cornstalks swaying like sentinels under the twilight sky. She tried to keep her voice light, asking about Harper, the gas station, anything to break the quiet. The driver glanced at her in the mirror, his eyes cold. "Not far," he said. His tone clipped. The men in the back said nothing, their presence a weight that pressed against Emily's chest. Sarah leaned closer, her shoulder brushing Emily's. A silent reassurance, but Emily's stomach twisted as she noticed the road veering away from the direction they'd come. The sign for Harper had pointed straight ahead, but this path curved into the fields, the asphalt giving way to gravel. She nudged Sarah, whispering, "This isn't right." Sarah's eyes widened, her bravado faltering. She turned to the driver. "Aren't we going to Harper?" The man didn't answer. The man beside him, bigger with a thick beard, laughed softly. "Change of plans," he said, his voice low, almost amused. Panic surged through Emily like a wildfire. She reached for the door handle, her fingers trembling, but it wouldn't budge. The handle was locked. Sarah's hand found hers, squeezing so tightly it hurt. The men in the back shifted closer, their bodies blocking any chance of escape. Emily's mind raced, replaying every warning her parents had drilled into her. Don't talk to strangers, don't get into strange cars. But they'd had no choice, had they? The road was empty, the night was coming, and this man had seemed so kind. The van slowed, turning onto a dirt path that snaked through a cluster of trees. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating twisted branches that seemed to claw at the sky. The van stopped in a clearing, the engine idling. The men turned to face the girls, their faces hard, unyielding. "What do you want?" Emily demanded, her voice shaking. The bearded man's grin widened, his eyes glinting with something cruel. "Just a little fun," he said. Sarah's breath hitched, her eyes brimming with tears. "Please," she whispered, "just let us go." For a moment, the clearing was silent, the tension thick enough to choke on. Then the driver spoke, his voice sharp, cutting through the bearded man's leer. "We don't need this kind of trouble, he said. "Let's just take them back." The bearded man's scowl deepened. "Why, they'll go to the cops." The driver shook his head, his expression unreadable. "We let them go. They'll be too scared to say anything. Besides, it's not worth it." The argument escalated, the men's voices low and heated, their words a blur of menace and restraint. Emily and Sarah sat frozen, their hands clasped, praying for a way out. The driver's voice won out, a sharp command that silenced the others. He turned to the girls, his face unreadable. "Get out!" he said, his tone flat. Emily's heart leapt, but she didn't trust it, not yet. They scrambled out of the van, stumbling on shaky legs. The cool night air hit them like a slap, the scent of earth and pine grounding them as they stood in the clearing. The driver pointed down the road. "Town's that way. Don't look back." Emily grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her along as they broke into a run, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. The van's engine roared behind them, the sound fading as it sped away. They didn't stop, didn't dare glance back, their lungs burning as they pushed forward. The trees gave way to open fields, the lights of Harper flickering in the distance like a beacon. They ran until their lungs burned, until the lights of Harper appeared on the horizon. They stumbled into the gas station, breathless and trembling, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. They begged the attendant to call the police. The police arrived quickly, their flashlights sweeping the lot as Emily and Sarah recounted the ordeal. Their car was still where they'd left it, untouched. The officers searched for the van, but it was gone, swallowed by the endless roads of the Midwest. The girls sat in the back of a patrol car, wrapped in blankets, their hands still clasped. The attendant filled a gas can for their car, and the police escorted them back to the hatchback, ensuring they could drive away safely. The road trip ended that night. Emily and Sarah drove straight to Denver, their laughter replaced by silence, their mixtapes untouched. The experience changed them. Emily became hyper-vigilant, her eyes scanning every stranger, every vehicle, for signs of danger. Sarah struggled with nightmares, waking in the night to the sound of engines and the smell of cigarettes. They stayed friends, bound by the shared terror of that evening, but the carefree spirit of their youth was gone, replaced by a hard-earned caution. Years later, Emily would drive alone at night, her headlights cutting through the dark. Every time she saw a van in her mirror, her heart would race, her hands tightening on the wheel. The memory of the van, the men, the clearing, it lingered like a scar. Sarah, too, carried the weight, her once bold demeanor softened by fear. They spoke of it rarely, but when they did, it was with a quiet understanding that they'd escaped something far worse than they could imagine. The Midwest roads still stretch on, endless and indifferent, hiding their dangers in plain sight. The open road is a place of freedom, but it's also a place where danger can hide in plain sight. Emily and Sarah learned that lesson the hard way, their trust in strangers shattered by a smile that wasn't what it seemed. The next time you find yourself stranded, remember Emily and Sarah. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and never ever get into a car with someone who makes you uneasy. The world is full of kindness, but it's also full of wolves wearing sheep's clothing, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. Story number 4. I've always loved the open road, the hum of the engine, the endless stretch of pavement, the way the world falls away when the city lights fade. There's freedom in it, a kind of peace you can't find anywhere else. But that night in Wyoming, the road turned on me. It wasn't just the darkness or the cold. It was like the highway itself was alive, watching, waiting for me to slip. The stars were out, sharp and bright, but they did little to light the way. I was driving through the back roads, my old sedan rattling over the uneven asphalt. My boyfriend, Tyler, was in the passenger seat, half asleep, his head resting against the window. We'd spent the day exploring Yellowstone, hiking trails and watching bison roam the plains. Now we were headed to a motel in Casper. But I'd chosen the scenic route, craving the wild emptiness of Wyoming's countryside. The road narrowed, trees creeping closer to the shoulder, their branches clawing at the sky. A chill settled in, and a thin mist rose from the fields. Curling in the glow of my headlights, I turned off the radio, my hands tightening on the wheel. Something felt wrong, like the air was too heavy, pressing against my chest. Tyler stirred, blinking sleepily. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, but my gut told me otherwise. I kept driving, the silence growing thicker, The road was deserted. No houses, no barns, just endless darkness. Then, in the distance, I saw them. 2 pinpoints of light, growing brighter. Headlights. Relief washed over me at first. Another car meant we weren't alone. But as they approached, my stomach twisted. The lights were too high, too wide, swaying unnaturally, like they weren't bound to the road. They came faster, blinding, cutting through the mist in jagged patterns. I slowed down, pulling to the right, my tires crunching gravel. The vehicle didn't slow, it barreled toward us. A hulking shape emerging from the fog, an old semi, rusted and battered. Its grille twisted into something menacing. I froze, my heart pounding, certain we were about to die. Then it happened. The truck passed right through us, leaving a cold so deep it burned. For a moment, neither Rachel nor Tyler could speak. They sat in stunned silence. The car idling in the middle of the road. I could barely breathe, my hands shaking on the wheel. Tyler's face was pale, his eyes wide. "What was that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer, I couldn't. The road ahead was empty, the headlights gone, swallowed by the night. I tried to start the car again, but the engine wouldn't turn over. Panic clawed at me. Rachel's hands shook so badly she could barely keep them on the wheel. What if it came back? What if we were stuck here, alone in this forsaken place? Tyler got out, checking under the hood, but everything looked fine. After a few agonizing minutes, the engine roared to life. I pulled back onto the road, my eyes glued to the mirrors, expecting those lights to reappear. The rest of the drive passed in a blur. They reached their motel just before dawn. Exhausted and shaken, we didn't sleep. We sat on the motel bed, trying to make sense of it. They tried to make sense of what had happened, but the memory of the truck, the way it had appeared out of nowhere, the way it had passed through them without a sound, defied explanation. The cold lingered in my bones, a reminder of something unnatural. The next morning, we stopped at a diner in Casper. The next day, they asked around at a local diner, describing what they'd seen. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes, listened quietly. When I finished, she nodded. "You saw the ghost rig," she said, her voice low. "You saw the ghost truck," she said. "Happens every few years, always on that stretch of road. Folks say it's the spirit of a trucker who died out there, back in the 70s. He was hauling cattle when his rig flipped in a storm. Now he drives that road, looking for someone to take his place." Her words sent a chill down my spine. I asked if others had seen it. She nodded again. "My uncle saw it once, years ago. Said it nearly ran him off the road. Some think it's just the mist playing tricks, but you're not the first to see it. And some folks say it's a spirit of a trucker who died out there years ago. Others say it's just a trick of the light, but you're not the first. And you won't be the last." We left the diner in silence, the weight of her words pressing on us. Rachel and Tyler left the diner in silence, the waitress's words echoing in their minds. The rest of our trip was quiet. The joy of the open road replaced by dread. I couldn't shake the image of that truck, its rusted frame, the way it moved through us like we were nothing. Rachel never took back roads again, never drove at night unless she had to. Years passed, but the memory stayed sharp. Years went by, but the memory never faded. Sometimes I'd wake up, heart racing, certain I could feel that cold again, seeping into my skin. Sometimes Rachel would wake in the middle of the night, heart racing, certain she could hear the blare of a horn and the roar of an engine. I started researching, digging into old stories about that stretch of highway. There were others, drivers who'd seen the same truck, felt the same cold, found their engines dead for no reason. One story stood out. A man named Eli, trucker from the 70s, had died on that road. His rig had skidded off during a storm, trapping him in the wreckage. Locals said he'd been hauling something strange that night, not cattle, but something he wouldn't talk about. Some claimed he'd made a deal with something dark to survive, but it hadn't let him go. Some said the truck was a warning, a harbinger of death. Others claimed it was the restless spirit of a man wronged, doomed to drive the same stretch of highway for eternity. I moved to the city, started a family, tried to leave it behind. Rachel never found an answer. She moved to the city, started a family, tried to put the past behind her, but the road still called to me. Sometimes I'd find myself driving at night, the highway stretching out, the darkness closing in, and she'd remember the ghost truck, the way it had appeared out of nowhere, the way it had passed through her like a shadow, leaving nothing but fear in its wake. The open road used to be my escape, a place where I could breathe. Now, it's a reminder that some things don't stay buried. The open road is a place of freedom, but it's also a place where the past lingers, where the dead refuse to rest. I've heard other stories since then, drivers who've seen the rig, who've felt that cold, and one man swore he saw a figure in the driver's seat, a shadow with no face, staring straight ahead, staring straight. I don't drive at night anymore, not if I can help it. Tyler and I don't talk about that night, but I see it in his eyes when we pass a semi on the highway, and Tyler tried to laugh it off. But Rachel could see the fear in his eyes whenever they passed a truck on the highway. The road has its secrets, and I've learned they're not always kind. Months after that night, I met another driver at a rest stop. He'd heard about the ghost rig, said it wasn't just one trucker's spirit. He claimed the highway itself was cursed, tied to something older than the roads we drive. He told me about a ritual whispered among old-timers. If you see the rig, you don't stop. You keep driving, no matter what, until you see daylight. I don't know if I believe him, but I've never tested it. The Wyoming plains are beautiful, but they're not safe. If you've ever driven a lonely road at night, if you've ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no reason, you know how quickly the familiar can turn strange. I still love the road, but I respect it now. It's not just pavement and signs. It's a place where the past can find you. So the next time you see headlights in your mirror, remember Rachel and Tyler. Remember that not everything on the road is what it seems. Story number 5. I was 22, fresh out of college. With the world at my feet and a car full of friends, we thought we were untouchable, chasing adventure on a road trip that was supposed to be our last big hurrah. But that night, on a lonely stretch of highway, I learned a lesson I'll never forget. Trust can be a trap, and danger can wear any face, even one with a badge. The air was thick with the promise of freedom, but it turned sour fast, and I'll carry that fear for the rest of my life. The road was dark, the kind that makes your headlights feel useless, like you're driving into a void. We'd been singing, laughing, but exhaustion was creeping in, and the cornfields outside were like walls closing in. When I saw those red and blue lights flashing behind us, I thought we were safe, that a cop meant protection. I slowed down, my heart lifting. But the moment that man stepped out of the cruiser, something felt wrong. His badge gleamed, but his eyes didn't. He was tall, his uniform crisp, but there was a coldness to him, a stillness that made my skin crawl. He spoke softly, asking where we were headed, but every word felt like a test. I told myself he was just doing his job, but my gut was screaming, warning me to run. We were young, naive, and miles from home. And that man was no savior, he was a hunter, and we were his prey. He led us down a road that wasn't on any map, deeper into the fields, away from the world we knew. The silence grew heavier, the cornfields tighter, and my friend's fear mirrored my own. When we reached a clearing with a crumbling barn looming in the dark, I knew we'd walked into a trap. The air felt wrong, like it was holding its breath. waiting for something terrible to happen. Then the other men appeared, their shotguns catching the moonlight, and my heart stopped. This wasn't a routine stop. This was planned, deliberate, evil. We were alone, miles from help, and the man with the badge wasn't a cop. He was the monster we'd been warned about, the kind that hides behind authority. I had to get us out, but my hands were shaking and the night was closing in. My name's Jess, and for most of my life, I had trusted the world, growing up in a small Indiana town where everyone knew everyone, where the police were neighbors and friends. I never doubted anyone. But that summer, me, Maya, Laya, and Hannah decided to take a road trip before the responsibilities of adulthood swallowed us whole. We just graduated college and the future felt like a wide-open highway. So we planned to hit Chicago, St. Louis, Memphis, and New Orleans, a last adventure before life got real. The first day was magic. The first leg of the trip was filled with laughter and music. Our car packed with snacks and inside jokes only we understood. We stopped at every tacky roadside attraction, a giant rubber band ball, a diner shaped like a UFO, snapping photos for Instagram, feeling invincible. But on the second night, in southern Illinois, everything changed. By the time we reached the rural highways, it was well past midnight. The world outside a blur of cornfields and darkness, lit only by our headlights and faint lightning in the distance. I was driving, my eyes burning from exhaustion, when I saw the red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. Relief washed over me. Thinking a cop meant we weren't alone out here, I pulled onto the shoulder, rolled down the window, and waited. The officer approached slowly, flashlight in hand, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming. "Evening, ladies," he said, his voice calm but heavy, like it carried a weight we couldn't see. I explained our road trip, my voice shaky. He nodded, shining his light into the car, pausing on each of their faces. His eyes cold, empty, like they saw nothing human in us. "I need you to step out of the car," he said, his tone leaving no room for questions. We hesitated, glancing at each other, but we got out. Standing on the shoulder as he checked our IDs, he studied each one carefully, then handed them back. "Now you girls shouldn't be out here this late," he said. "These roads can be dangerous. There's been some trouble in the area, break-ins, assaults. I'm going to escort you to a safer place." I wanted to believe he was protecting us, but his voice felt wrong, like he was reading lines he'd practiced too many times. We drove for miles, the police car leading the way, its lights flashing in the darkness. The road got narrower, the cornfields pressing in like a cage. The GPS had stopped working, and there were no signs, no houses, just endless rows of stalks. The cruiser turned onto a dirt road, barely wide enough for the car. I hesitated, my hands tight on the wheel, but he flashed his lights, urging us forward. My heart was pounding as we followed, but the road twisting deeper into nowhere, like it was pulling us into a nightmare. We reached a clearing where a dilapidated barn stood silhouetted against the sky. The officer got out, motioning for us to park. My hands shook as I turned off the engine, the silence deafening. The officer approached, his face unreadable. "I need to check your car," he said. "There have been reports of stolen property." I nodded, too scared to argue, but my gut was screaming that this wasn't right. Then, another set of headlights appeared, and a pickup truck rolled in. 2 men got out, shotguns slung over their shoulders. Panic hit me like an ambulatory bandito. My blood turned to ice. The officer spoke quietly with the men, then turned to us. "I need one of you to come with me," he said, his eyes settling on Maya. She backed away, shaking her head. "Why? What did we do?" "Just a few questions," he said, his voice hard. I stepped forward, my voice shaking. "We want to stay together." The officer's face darkened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he said, as the men with shotguns stepped closer. Their faces hidden in shadow. My mind was racing. This wasn't a cop. This was a predator, and we were his prey. I grabbed Maya's hand, pulling her back. "We're not going anywhere," I said, my voice stronger than I felt. The officer stared, his jaw tight. For a moment, I thought he'd force us, but he glanced at the men, and something passed between them, a silent signal. He sighed, stepping back. "Fine," he said, "get in your car and go. But if I see you out here again, well, there will be consequences." We scrambled into the car, my hands fumbling with the keys. I floored it, gravel flying as we sped away. In the rear-view mirror, I saw the men watching us go, their faces cold and blank. We drove for miles, not stopping, not speaking, until we hit a main road. I pulled over, my hands shaking so bad I could barely hold the wheel. We huddled together, crying and shaking, the fear spilling out like a flood. We called the police, but the dispatcher's words chilled me. "Are you sure it was a real officer?" she asked. "There haven't been any patrols in that area tonight." I described the cruiser, the badge, the men with shotguns, but she didn't believe me. We spent the night in a gas station, too scared to move. In the morning, we tried to retrace our route, but the dirt road was gone. The barn gone, like a dream we couldn't wake from. That experience changed us. I became wary, mistrustful of authority. Maya struggled with nightmares, hearing footsteps in the dark. Laia and Hannah withdrew, their friendship strained by the trauma. We never learned who that man was or what he wanted. The police called it stress. But I know what I saw, those cold eyes, that fake badge, the threat in his voice, and I tell my story to anyone who'll listen, warning them to trust their instincts, to never follow a stranger, no matter how official they seem. The open road is freedom, but it's also a trap. Danger can hide behind any face, even one sworn to protect you. So stay sharp, stay together, and never let your guard down. I still see those flashing lights in my dreams, hear that voice, feel that fear, and I know I'm not alone. There are others out there with stories like mine. Stories of trust, betrayed by a badge. If you've got one, share it. Your warning could save someone. Story number 6. I'd been hauling cargo across this country for over a decade, and I thought I'd seen it all. Blizzard-blocked highways, ghost towns swallowed by dust, and diners with coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But nothing prepared me for the night I stumbled into a place that wasn't supposed to exist. It was late. The kind of late where the world feels like it's holding its breath. And I was bone-tired, my rig rattling down a lonely stretch of Interstate 70. The signs glowed out of the darkness like a beacon, promising fuel, food, and rest at a place called Big Jim's Plaza. Something about those signs felt off, like they were too bright, too perfect. But my tank was low, and my eyelids were heavier than my load. So I turned off the highway and into the unknown. I pulled into what appeared to be a new facility on Interstate 70 in Missouri. The lot was massive, lit up like a stadium, with rows of rigs parked in neat lines. The truck stop appeared completely normal from the highway, its neon signs buzzing with promises of cheap diesel and hot meals. I eased my rig into the fuel island, the hum of the pump a familiar comfort. But as I filled my tank, I noticed the price, way lower than anywhere else I'd stopped that week. The diesel price was significantly lower than what I had been seeing at other stops. I mentioned it to the attendant, a wiry guy with a smile that didn't quite match his eyes. "We like to keep folks coming back," he said, his voice smooth as oil. I nodded, but a prickle ran down my neck, like I'd just stepped into a trap I couldn't see. The air in the lot felt wrong, heavy, like it was pressing down on my shoulders. Other drivers moved through the shadows, but they weren't talking, weren't joking. No rough laughter or CB chatter spilling from open cabs. I saw a man standing by his rig, staring at nothing, his eyes like empty sockets in the sodium lights. The main building loomed ahead, its glass doors reflecting my own tired face back at me. I pushed inside, expecting the usual truck stop buzz, but the silence hit me like a wall, broken only by the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The interior of the truck stop was impressive, clean, well-stocked, and modern. Shelves were packed with snacks, drinks, and gear, all neatly arranged. The restaurant section was open, serving steaming plates of food despite the hour. There were quite a few other truckers inside, but they were quiet. Too quiet. Some sat at tables, forks frozen mid-bite. Others wandered the aisles like ghosts, their movements slow and mechanical. I grabbed a coffee and some jerky, trying to shake the unease. At the checkout counter, a friendly middle-aged woman rang up my purchases. "You staying with us tonight?" she asked, her smile too wide, her eyes too sharp. "We have excellent sleeping facilities, and many of our customers find that once they rest here, they don't want to leave." I shook my head, muttering something about sleeping in my rig. Her smile didn't falter, but her words lingered like a bad smell. That's what they all say at first. I hurried out, the weight of her gaze boring into my back. As I walked back to my truck, I noticed the other drivers in the lot. They were moving very slowly and deliberately, their steps heavy, like they were wading through molasses. One guy stood by his trailer, staring into the distance, his face blank as a mannequin's. I climbed into my cab, eager to hit the road, but when I turned the key, nothing happened. The dashboard lit up, the radio crackled, but the engine was dead as a doornail. My rig had been running fine for years, not a single hiccup, and now it wouldn't even cough. Panic crept in, cold and sharp. As I tried the key again and again, the lot outside seemed to close in, the other trucks looming like silent sentinels. I went back inside to ask if there was a mechanic on duty. The clerk looked at me like she'd been expecting me. "Engines act up sometimes around here," she said, her tone too casual. "Try Jim. He's in the restaurant." The clerk directed me to a man named Jim, a big guy with a friendly grin, sitting alone with a coffee. He followed me out, tinkering under the hood for a few minutes. He claimed to have found the problem, a loose electrical connection. My rig roared to life, and I thanked him, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Come back any time," he said, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. I prepared to leave, but something made me check my rig one last time. That's when I saw it, a small metallic device wired into the engine compartment, glowing faintly with a red light. I froze. Every single truck in the parking lot had the same modification. I checked another rig, then another. Each one had the same device, tucked away like a parasite. My hands shook as I ripped the thing off my engine and tossed it into a dumpster. I quickly left the parking lot without looking back. The highway stretched out before me, dark and empty. But as I glanced in my mirrors, I saw them, several rigs pulling out behind me, their headlights cutting through the night like eyes. A convoy of trucks stayed behind me, keeping pace no matter how fast I drove. I grabbed my CB radio, desperate for help, but the voices that came through were wrong, flat, lifeless, chanting, "You can't leave Big Jim's and come back to the plaza where you belong." I floored the gas, my heart pounding like a drum. The convoy followed, relentless, their engines roaring in unison like a pack of wolves. I took a sharp exit, weaving through back roads, my rig groaning under the strain. The headlights faded, but the fear didn't. I knew I wasn't out of this yet. By dawn, I reached a familiar truck stop, one I knew was real. and called the cops, and I tried to provide the location of Big Jim's 24-hour plaza, but my GPS showed nothing, just an empty lot where the exit should have been. The police were skeptical until I showed them the device I'd kept in my pocket. The device turned out to be a sophisticated tracking and control system, far beyond anything they'd seen. They sent a team to check the site, but all they found was cracked concrete and weeds. The ghost of a truck stop long gone. The cops dug deeper, and what they found turned my blood cold. Local records showed that a facility called Big Jim's Plaza had operated at that location in the 1980s and 1990s. It shut down after the owner, James Morrison, died in a crash caused by a strange electronic system that failed his brakes. The technology was similar in design to the device that Rebecca found attached to her own truck. I started asking around, talking to other drivers, and the stories piled up. Over the past 15 years, Missouri State Police had received at least 8 similar reports from truckers, drivers who'd stopped at Big Jim's, had engine trouble, met a guy named Jim, and found those damn devices on their rigs. Some never made it out. 3 truckers who had reported stopping at the Phantom truck stop had subsequently disappeared. Their rigs were found abandoned, empty, along the highway. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd escaped something bigger, something that wasn't done with me. Months later, a postcard arrived at my home, showing a pristine Big Jim's Plaza under a blood-red sky. The message read, "We miss you at Big Jim's. Your sleeping room is still available whenever you're ready to come home." It was postmarked from a Missouri town, but the post office swore they'd never processed it. My GPS started acting up too, trying to route me back to that empty lot. Even when I was states away, I shared my story with other truckers through online forums, and the pattern was clear. Others had gotten the same postcards, the same eerie calls to return. Some said their rigs would stall on that stretch of highway, their engines cutting out for no reason. I changed my routes, avoiding Missouri like it was cursed. I've installed multiple backup GPS systems and carry paper maps. I joined a group of drivers who swap stories about weird stops, strange devices, and roads that don't exist. I've learned to trust my instincts completely. If something feels off, I don't care how bright the lights are or how cheap the fuel is, I'm gone. But the memory of Big Jim's lingers, like a shadow in my rearview mirror. I dug into the history of James Morrison, the man behind the name. According to newspaper accounts, Morrison died when his truck's brakes failed, crashing into a bridge. The report mentioned an experimental system, eerily like the one I'd found. I keep that device locked in a box, a reminder of how close I came to whatever Big Jim's really is.
Every mile I drive, I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. Some nights, I hear static on my CB, and a voice, low, lifeless, whispers my name. I check my mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights trailing me again. And Big Jim's isn't just a truck stop. It's a trap, a machine that doesn't let go. And somewhere, out there on Interstate 70, I know it's still calling, waiting for the next driver to pull in.
Story number 7. For as long as I can remember, I've been fiercely independent. I've always chased adventure, the kind that comes with open roads and new horizons. The world felt safe enough if you were smart, and I was. I'd driven cross-country twice before, each trip a tapestry of new faces and stories. It was the summer after my college graduation, and I decided to take one last road trip before settling into my first real job. A journey from my childhood home in Vermont all the way to San Diego. This was my last taste of freedom, and I was ready to drink it in. My parents fretted, but I waved them off with a grin. I had a reliable car, a carefully planned route, and a phone loaded with emergency contacts. Nothing could go wrong, I told myself, as I pulled out into the sunrise with air and the world stretching out before me. The first days were a dream. I wound through New England's green hills, savored lobster rolls in Connecticut, and watched New York's skyline fade in my rear view. I camped in state parks, spent a night in a quirky bed and breakfast in Ohio, and marveled at the endless fields of the Midwest. Every mile felt like a victory, a proof of my independence. I snapped photos at every stop, texting them to my parents to keep them at ease. By Kansas. The road was my home, and their warnings seemed like distant echoes, but somewhere between Salina and Dodge City, the world turned dark. The road was empty. The fields on either side stretching out to the horizon. The sunset painted the sky in fire. But a chill settled in my bones. I ignored it at first, blaming the long hours behind the wheel. I passed a sign for a rest area 10 miles ahead and decided to push on, my stomach rumbling with anticipation. But the emptiness of the highway gnawed at me, a quiet that felt too heavy, and for the first time all trip, I felt a flicker of unease. I cranked up the radio, trying to drown it out. But it lingered. Then I saw him, a man on the shoulder, hazard lights flashing, arms waving. A man stood beside it, waving his arms, his face etched with worry. He looked desperate, stranded, and my heart tugged. I hesitated, my parents' warnings echoing in my mind. But the man looked desperate, and I couldn't ignore the pang of empathy that rose in my chest. I slowed, rolling down my window. "Are you okay?" I called, keeping my distance. He said his name was Tom, mid-30s, clean-shaven, in jeans and a faded t-shirt. His car had broken down and his phone was dead. He needed a ride to the next town, just a few miles away. I weighed my options. The road stretching empty behind me. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Unlocking the passenger door and gesturing for him to get in, his gratitude felt warm, disarming. He thanked me profusely. Introducing himself as Tom, he chatted about growing up in Kansas, his family in Colorado, and I relaxed, thinking I'd misjudged him. But when we reached the rest area, everything changed. Tom asked if I could wait while he used the restroom. I nodded, parking and checking my phone. A few minutes later, Tom returned, but something in his demeanor had changed. His eyes were sharp, darting, no longer friendly. He was quieter, his eyes darting nervously around the lot. Before I could react, he lunged. Tom lunged, grabbing me by the arm and dragging me from the car. I fought, kicking, clawing, but he was too strong. He forced me into the trunk of his car, slamming the lid shut before I could escape. Darkness swallowed me, the air thick with oil and old carpet. The trunk was dark, hot, and smelled of oil and old carpet. Panic clawed at my chest as I pounded on the metal, my voice lost in the void. I fumbled in the dark, searching for an escape. I tried to remember everything I'd ever read about escaping from a trunk. Look for the emergency release. Kick out the tail lights. Stay calm. My fingers found a rusted tire iron, but no release latch. The car started, the engine rumbling beneath me. The motion threw me off balance. Each turn, a disorienting lurch. I tried to keep track of the turns, the stop, the sounds outside. But fear clouded my mind. I sobbed, my body trembling, thinking of my parents, my friends, the life I'd planned. Time lost all meaning in the darkness. I drifted, my mind replaying every mistake, every ignored warning.
The car stopped, and voices broke the silence. Tom and another man, their words muffled by the trunk. I caught fragments. "She's in the trunk. No one saw. The old place." Her blood ran cold as she realized she wasn't just dealing with one captor, but two. The trunk opened, a flashlight blinding me. Tom and the other man, a burly, bearded figure with cold eyes. dragged her from the trunk, binding her hands with duct tape. They shoved me into a back seat, wedged between them, and drove. They stopped at an abandoned farmhouse. Its windows boarded up and its yard overgrown with weeds. The house loomed like a predator, its shadows swallowing the moonlight.
They dragged me inside, locking me in a small, windowless room. The air was stale, the walls rough with splinters. I searched for a way out, testing the door, the walls, the floorboards. Nothing gave. Days passed in a blur of fear and exhaustion. The men brought scraps of food, saying little. I heard them arguing outside my door, their voices rising and falling as snippets of their plans slipped through. Ransom, waiting for the right time. I clung to hope, telling myself that someone would come looking for me, that I would find a way out. But the walls seemed to close in, each day heavier than the last. One night, a faint sound came from the wall, a whisper, barely audible, filtered through the wall. I pressed my ear to the plaster, heart racing. "Are you okay?" A girl's voice, trembling. The voice, soft, trembling, belonged to another captive. A teenage girl named Mia. She'd been taken weeks ago, snatched from a bus stop. Mia had given up hope of rescue, but Olivia's arrival had rekindled a spark of determination. We whispered plans, our voices barely breaths, plotting escape. I found a loose floorboard, prying it up with a shard of broken glass. Beneath it was a rusted nail. I used it to pick at the lock on my door. It took days, each scrape a risk, but the lock gave. I waited until the men were asleep, then crept into Mia's room, freeing her from her bonds. We moved silently, hearts pounding, every shadow a threat. They found a phone in the kitchen, but it was dead. The front door was locked, the windows barred. Finally, discovering a cellar door that led to the backyard, we slipped out. The night air sharp against our skin. They slipped into the night, running through the overgrown yard and into the woods beyond. Branches tore at us, but we ran, stumbling until we hit a road. I flagged down a passing car, my voice hoarse with relief. The driver called the police, and help came fast. The police arrived within minutes, arresting Tom and his accomplice. Mia and I were taken to a hospital, our families' faces a blur of tears and relief. The ordeal had lasted less than a week, but it felt like a lifetime. The world I'd loved felt different now, sharper, more dangerous. The experience changed me forever. I see that trunk in my dreams, feel the darkness closing in. I became cautious, wary of strangers, haunted by nightmares of the trunk and the darkness. But I found strength too. I told my story to anyone who would listen, warning others to trust their instincts, to be careful on the road, to never take safety for granted. I work with missing persons groups now, helping those who've been taken, lost, forgotten. I became an advocate for missing persons, working to help others who had been taken, lost, or forgotten. The road is freedom, but it's also a trap. If you've ever trusted a stranger, if you've ever ignored that flicker of unease, you know how quickly the world can turn dangerous. That trip broke something in me, but it built something too. Mia and I stay in touch, bound by what we survived. Every day, I fight to reclaim the fearless girl I was, but I'm wiser now. The road still calls, but I listen to my gut, and I never stop for strangers. The open road is a place of freedom, but it's also a place where evil can hide in plain sight. Story number 8. My name is Adam, and I've always loved driving. The road's been my sanctuary since I was a kid, the place where I feel alive, in control, like the world makes sense.
the hum of the engine, the blur of the world outside my windows. It's freedom. But one night, on a lonely stretch of highway between Fernie and Longview, my car turned on me, and I learned just how fragile that freedom is. This isn't a ghost story or a tale of monsters. It's worse. It's about the slow, creeping terror of a machine failing you when you're miles from help, with nothing but rain and darkness for company.
I'd spent the weekend with my sister in Fernie, hiking the trails, laughing over old memories. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with rain. But I wasn't worried. I knew the route like the back of my hand, a winding ribbon through the Canadian foothills. Quiet but familiar. I filled the tank, checked the oil, and hit the road with my favorite playlist humming through the speakers. The first hour was perfect. The kind of drive that makes you feel untouchable. Then it started, a hesitation, a lag when I pushed the gas pedal, just a hiccup. I thought, maybe bad fuel. I should have known better. The road was empty, the hills swallowing the last light of dusk. The engine started to stutter, losing power on the climbs, the car jerking like it was fighting to stay alive. I killed the music, listening hard. The sound was wrong, uneven, strained, like the engine was choking. No warning lights, no smoke. Nothing obvious under the hood when I pulled over. I checked everything, oil, gas cap, battery cables, all fine. I started her up again, and she caught. But the idle was rough, the whole frame shaking, and something was dying under there. And I was too far from anywhere to fix it. I kept driving, slower now, my hands tight on the wheel. The road stretched out, trees pressing in, the sky turning black. No cell signal, no towns for miles, just me and a car that was giving up. The fear grew slowly, a cold knot in my stomach. I started talking to her, pleading like she could hear me. Come on, girl, just a little farther. Every hill felt like a battle. The engine struggling, the dashboard dimming. I turned off the radio, the AC, even the headlights when I could, trying to save power. Rain started falling, a drizzle at first, then a downpour. The wipers barely kept up, smearing water across the glass. I was alone, utterly alone, and the realization hit like a fist. The nearest town, Longview, was 60 kilometers away. No one was coming. The rain hammered the roof. The road slick and treacherous. I kept the revs high, terrified the engine would stall if I let it drop. Every shadow looked like a deer, every curve like a trap. I saw the sign, Longview, 60 kilometers, and it felt like a cruel joke. My mind started playing tricks, shapes in the trees, or faces in the rain. I saw myself stranded, walking for miles, freezing in the dark. The stories came back. People lost on roads like this, well, found days later. Or not at all. The fear wasn't sudden. It built mile by mile, each lurch of the car tightening the knot in my gut. I kept my eyes on the dashboard, watching the temperature gauge climb, the oil pressure flicker. The engine was screaming now, a grinding, unnatural sound that vibrated through my bones. I could smell burning oil, feel heat rising from the floorboards. I was pushing her past her limits, and she was fighting back. I started counting kilometers, whispering them like a prayer. 50, 45, 40. The rain never stopped. The darkness never lifted. I didn't dare look at the clock. Time didn't matter out here. All that mattered was moving forward, inch by inch, against a machine that wanted to quit. At one point, I thought it was over. The car slowed to a crawl, the lights dimming, the dashboard flickering like it was possessed. I pulled over, hands shaking, and sat in the dark, listening to the rain. I tried to picture flagging someone down, but the road was a graveyard, no headlights, no life. I turned the key, begging. She caught, barely. The engine, coughing like a dying animal. I crept back onto the road, every nerve raw, every sound a warning. The grinding grew worse, metal on metal, like the car was tearing itself apart. I didn't know if I was driving to safety or my own grave. The hours blurred into a haze of rain and fear. I stopped trusting my eyes, my ears, my own mind. I imagined the car dying, leaving me stranded in the wilderness. I thought of my sister, my parents, how they'd never know what happened. The engine was barely alive, each mile a miracle. Then I saw it, lights in the distance, faint through the rain, long view. I let out a sob, half relief, half disbelief. I coasted into a gas station, and the engine gave out, shuddering into silence. I sat there, head on the steering wheel, tears mixing with the rain on my face. The attendant came out, tapping the window, and I told him everything, my voice shaking. He called a tow truck, and I watched them load my car, feeling like I'd lost a part of myself. The mechanic said the engine was shot, a catastrophic failure. It should have left me stranded miles back. I checked into a motel, but sleep wouldn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on that road, hearing the engine's death rattle, feeling the weight of the dark. I sold the car for scrap, took a bus home, and swore I'd never drive that route again.
I'm not the same guy I was before that night. The experience changed me, left scars I can't explain. I used to love driving, lived for the open road. Now, every time I get behind the wheel, I'm waiting for the next failure, the next betrayal. I check my car obsessively, oil, tires, belts, fluids. I never let the gas tank drop below half. If I hear a strange noise, I pull over, heart racing, expecting the worst. Night drives are the hardest. The dark feels heavier now, like it's watching me.
I told my story to anyone who'd listen. Friends, family, strangers at the bar. Most didn't get it, didn't understand the terror of being alone with a dying machine. They'd nod, say, "That sounds rough," but they hadn't felt it. The slow dread. The way the road seemed to want you to fail. My sister tried to help, got me to talk to a therapist. They called it PTSD, said it'd fade. It hasn't. I still see that road in my dreams. The rain, the shadows. I wake up checking my hands, half expecting them to be gripping a steering wheel. I started researching, trying to understand what happened. The mechanic said it was a fuel pump failure, compounded by a clogged injector. But that didn't explain why it held on so long. I found forums online, stories from other drivers who'd been stranded, who'd felt that same creeping fear. And one guy in Manitoba said his truck died in a snowstorm, left him for 3 days until a plow found him. Another, in Oregon, said her car quit on a mountain pass, and she swore she heard footsteps circling it in the dark. We're a quiet community, bound by roads we'll never drive again. I bought a new car, a reliable one, or so they say, but I don't trust it. I've developed a fear of being alone on the road, of the silence when the engine stops. I keep a roadside kit now, flares, blankets, a satellite phone. I plan every trip like a military operation, mapping gas stations, checking weather reports. My friends laugh, call me paranoid. They don't know what it's like to feel your life hanging on a spark plug, to know the machine you trust most can turn on you. I drive less now, stick to cities, avoid the long hauls. The fear never leaves, though, that slow dread that builds with every mile. I've started teaching others, sharing what I learned. Check your fluids, listen to your engine, know your route. It's not just maintenance, it's survival. I tell them about that night, about the rain, the darkness, the way the car fought to keep me alive. Some listen, some don't. I just hope they never have to learn the hard way. I went back to that stretch of highway once, not to drive it, just to see it. It looked different in daylight, ordinary, almost peaceful, but I could still feel it. That weight in the air, like the road remembered me. I stood there, staring at the mile markers, wondering how many others had been tested out there. I'll never know why my car held on as long as it did. Why I made it when others didn't. Like maybe it was luck, maybe something else. All I know is I'm still here, and I'm not taking it for granted. I tell my story because someone needs to hear it. If you've ever been stranded, if you felt that cold knot of fear, you know what I mean. The road's a beautiful place, but it's also unforgiving. It doesn't care if you live or die. So, check your car, plan your route, and never assume you're safe. Because sometimes, the scariest thing out there isn't a ghost or a stranger. It's the machine you trust, waiting to fail you when you're most alone. Story number 9. I was behind the wheel of our old Chevy Suburban, my family's laughter filling the air as we rolled through the Midwest's endless fields. The kids were in the back, arguing over who'd caught the biggest fish at the lake. My wife, Linda, was reading a map, her voice soft and steady. Then I saw it, a sickly green sky swallowing the horizon. My gut twisted. I'd grown up in Tornado Alley, knew that color meant trouble, but nothing could have prepared me for what was coming. For the moment, the world turned against us. We were halfway home when the rain hit. Not a drizzle, but a wall of water that drowned the road. The wind screamed, bending trees like they were made of rubber. My hands shook on the wheel as the radio crackled with a warning. Tornado sighted. Take cover now. My kids went silent, their faces pale in the rearview mirror. I scanned the flat. Empty fields, no shelter, no escape. The storm wasn't just chasing us, it wouldn't mean that, it was hunting us. I pulled over behind a line of cars, their hazard lights blinking like desperate signals in the dark. A driver ahead yelled through the rain, his voice barely cutting through the roar. Tornadoes coming! Roads blocked! My heart pounded as I looked at my family, Linda's wide eyes, Sophie clutching her stuffed bear. There was nowhere to hide but a cluster of trees off the road. I made the call. Run! I shouted, grabbing my youngest. The wind tried to tear us apart before we even reached the grove. Huddled under that tree, the world became a nightmare. The air roared, not like a storm, but like a beast, tearing at our clothes, our skin. Debris flew, branches, metal, pieces of someone's life. My daughter Jenna screamed as a limb whipped past her head. I held my family tight, my arms burning, praying the tree wouldn't snap. This can't be how it ends, I thought. But the storm didn't care, wanted everything, our car, our safety, our sense of who we were. When the wind finally died, we stumbled back to the road, soaked and shaking. Our Suburban was gone, swallowed by the storm. The highway was a graveyard of twisted metal and uprooted trees. My kids clung to me, their eyes hollow. We'd survived, but at what cost? The storm didn't just take our car, it took pieces of us, our courage, our trust in the world. And I knew, as we stood in that wreckage, we'd never be the same. For the Miller family, road trips were a summer tradition. Every June, we'd pack our Chevy Suburban with sleeping bags, fishing rods, and enough snacks to last a week. Every year, as soon as school let out, they would load up their old Chevy Suburban with sleeping bags, fishing poles, and enough snacks to feed an army and set off across the Midwest in search of adventure. My kids, Jenna, 15, Max, 12, and little Sophie, 8, lived for these trips. They'd fight over the radio, play I Spy, and beg for stops at every quirky roadside attraction. Linda and I loved it too, watching their faces light up at a new lake or a starry night. Their parents, Tom and Linda, cherished these trips too, seeing them as a way to reconnect as a family and create memories that would last a lifetime. This summer, we headed to my brother's cabin by a lake in Oklahoma. The summer of 2007 was no different. The plan was to drive from their home in Topeka, Kansas, to a remote lake in Oklahoma, where Tom's brother owned a rustic cabin. I'd grown up in Kansas, knew the Midwest's moods better than most. The route would take them through the heart of Tornado Alley, but Tom wasn't worried. I checked the weather obsessively, confident I could keep my family safe. We set out under a clear blue sky, the kids singing off-key in the back. They set out on a bright June morning, the sky a perfect blue, the fields shimmering with new wheat. The first day was perfect. We stopped for burgers in a small town, took selfies with a giant fiberglass cow, and laughed until our sides hurt. The first day passed in a blur of small towns, roadside diners, and endless stretches of highway. The cabin was everything we'd hoped: pine-scented air, a glassy lake, woods that seemed to whisper adventure. They spent the next 2 days fishing, swimming, and exploring the woods, their laughter echoing across the water. At night, we roasted marshmallows with toll, the firelight dancing on my kids' faces as they told silly ghost stories. At night, they sat around the fire roasting marshmallows and telling ghost stories. But by the third day, the air changed. It felt thick, heavy, like the world was holding its breath. On the third day, the weather changed. The air grew heavy, the sky turning a strange, sickly green that Tom recognized all too well. I checked the radio. Severe thunderstorm warnings, possible tornadoes. He checked the radio, listening to the forecast. Linda wanted to leave, but I hesitated. Linda suggested they pack up and head home early, but Tom hesitated. The kids were having the time of their lives there, and the storm was hours away. I figured we could beat it. Biggest mistake I ever made. We packed in a rush, throwing gear into the Suburban as the sky darkened. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened, piling up on the horizon like bruised mountains. The wind rattled the cabin's windows, and the lake churned with whitecaps. The wind picked up, rattling the windows of the cabin and sending ripples across the lake. I turned on the radio. The weatherman's voice grim. Tornado watch for the region. The radio warned of a tornado watch for the entire region. I told myself we could outrun it. Tom was confident they could outrun the storm if they left immediately. We hit the road, the mood tense but hopeful. They set out, the mood in the car tense but hopeful. Linda kept the kids busy with stories, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Linda tried to keep the kids calm, distracting them with stories and games. The sky turned black, clouds swirling like a nightmare. The sky darkened, the clouds swirling overhead, and the first drops of rain began to fall. Then the storm hit, hard. As they crossed into northern Oklahoma, the storm hit. Rain poured, blinding me. The wind roared, shaking the car. The rain came in sheets, blinding and relentless. The wind howling like a living thing. I slowed to a crawl, wipers useless, and Tom slowed to a crawl, the wipers useless against the deluge. Lightning lit up the fields. Stark and terrifying. Lightning flashed, illuminating the fields in stark, unnatural light. The radio screamed, "Tornado warning! Take cover immediately." The radio crackled with static. The voice of the weatherman barely audible. "Tornado warning! Take cover immediately." My heart raced. There was no shelter, just endless fields. Tom scanned the roadside for a place to pull over, but the fields were empty. Then Linda pointed ahead. Suddenly, Linda shouted, "There's something up ahead!" Cars were stopped, their lights flashing. A line of cars stopped on the highway, their hazard lights blinking in the gloom. I pulled over, talked to a driver. His face was ashen. The man's face was pale, his voice shaking. "There's a tornado coming this way. We can't go forward." The road was blocked by fallen trees, but the road's blocked by downed trees. He said we needed shelter, fast. We need to find shelter. I looked around. No overpasses, no ditches, just a grove of trees 50 yards away. There was no overpass, no ditch deep enough to offer protection. The only option was a small grove of trees about 50 yards from the road. I made the call. "Out, now!" Tom made a split-second decision. "Everyone out now." We scrambled from the car, the wind nearly knocking us down. The family scrambled from the car, the wind nearly knocking them off their feet. I grabbed Sophie, her small body trembling. Linda held Max, and Jenna clung to her mother. Tom grabbed Sophie, Linda took Max, and Jenna held tight to her mother's hand as they ran for the trees. The rain stung like needles, but the rain was like needles, stinging their faces, were soaking them to the bone. We reached the grove, huddling under the biggest tree. They reached the grove, huddling together at the base of the largest tree. I wrapped my arms around them, trying to shield them from the flying debris. Tom wrapped his arms around his family, trying to shield them from the debris flying through the air. The wind roared, louder than anything I'd ever heard. The roar of the wind grew louder. Jenna screamed as a branch flew past. Jenna screamed as a branch whipped past her head, missing her by inches. I held on, my muscles burning, my mind screaming one thing: keep them safe. The tornado hit, a force beyond imagining. The tornado hit with a force that defied comprehension. It tore at us, pulling at our clothes, our hair. The wind tore at them, pulling at their clothes, their hair, their very breath. Trees snapped around us, the ground shaking. The trees bent and snapped, the ground littered with branches and debris. It felt like the world was ending, like we were nothing against this monster. Then, as suddenly as it came, it passed. The wind began to die, the roar fading to a distant rumble. The rain slowed, the air still. The rain slackened, the air suddenly still. We stumbled back to the road, muddy, bleeding, but alive. Tom opened his eyes, blinking against the mud and blood on his face. His family was alive, shaken, but unharmed. The devastation was unreal. Cars flipped, trees uprooted, power lines down. They stumbled back to the road, the devastation laid bare in the weak light. Cars were overturned, trees uprooted, power lines downed. Our Suburban was gone, swept away, and the Suburban was gone, swept away by the storm. Other survivors appeared, their faces stunned. Other families emerged from the wreckage, their faces pale and stunned. Emergency crews arrived, picking through the chaos. Emergency crews arrived, picking their way through the debris, searching for survivors. We were taken to a shelter, huddling together, grateful to be alive. The Millers were taken to a nearby shelter where they huddled together, grateful to be alive. The tornado was an EF4, one of the worst in years. They learned that the tornado had been an EF4, one of the strongest in years, carving a path of destruction for miles. Back home, the scars lingered. In the days that followed, the family struggled to process what had happened. Jenna woke screaming from nightmares. The kids had nightmares, waking in the night to the sound of wind and rain. Max buried himself in weather books, trying to understand what had happened. Max became obsessed with weather patterns, reading everything he could about tornadoes and how to survive them. Sophie drew dark, swirling clouds. Our family huddled under that tree. Sophie, the youngest, drew pictures of the storm, dark clouds, swirling winds. Her family huddled together beneath a tree. I blamed myself. Tom blamed himself for not leaving sooner, for putting his family in danger. Linda tried to comfort me, but she was haunted too. Linda tried to reassure him, but she too was haunted by the memory of the storm. We weren't the same. The experience changed them, leaving scars both visible and invisible. Jenna, once fearless, flinched at every storm cloud. Jenna, once fearless, developed a deep-seated fear of storms. The kids we'd been, the family we'd been, were gone. Stolen by that wind. We tried to heal, joined a support group, sharing our story with other survivors, and Tom attended support groups for survivors, sharing his story with others who had faced the same terror. Linda volunteered, helping families who'd lost everything. Linda volunteered at the local Red Cross, helping families who had lost everything to the storm. Our story spread. A warning to others. The Miller's story became a cautionary tale in their community, a reminder of how quickly life can change, how fragile safety really is. The road used to mean freedom, now it means fear. Every time I see a green sky, I'm back in that grove, holding my family, praying we'll make it. The storm took more than our car, it took our trust in the world, and I know deep down it's still out there, waiting for the next family to drive into its path. Story number 10.
I was rolling through the Midwest, the highway stretching out like a ribbon under a thin moon, when I saw her, a woman, alone, standing on an overpass, her eyes locked on my truck. She wasn't moving, wasn't waving, just staring. Her gaze cut through the night, heavy with something I couldn't name. Sadness? Anger? I don't know, but it felt like she saw right through me, into parts of my soul I had long forgotten.
An hour later, I saw her again. Same woman, same long coat, same haunting stare on a different overpass. Miles away. How could she be there? I hadn't passed a single car. No side roads she could have taken. My hands shook on the wheel, my coffee gone cold. Was she real, or was the road playing tricks on me? The highway felt alive, like it was hiding something just beyond my headlights. Every overpass became a test. Some were empty, but then, there she was again, standing like a statue, watching me pass. Each time, her eyes seemed to pull at me, like she wanted me to stop, to listen. My heart pounded, my mind racing with questions. Who was she? Why me? The road wasn't just a road anymore, it was her domain. And I was trespassing, at a truck stop. I asked around, my voice low, half ashamed. An old driver nodded, his eyes distant. You saw her, didn't you? He said. Others had seen her too, always at night, always alone. They called her a ghost, a memory, a warning, but no one knew her story, only that she left you changed. I wasn't alone, but that only made it worse. I've driven 1,000 highways, but that night changed me. The woman on the overpass wasn't just a figure, she was a mark on my soul. I can't drive that route anymore without feeling her eyes, without wondering if she's still out there. Waiting. The open road is freedom, but it's also a place where the past lingers, where the lost watch and wait, and I'll never be sure if I escaped her, or if she's still with me. I had spent most of my adult life behind the wheel of a semi, traversing the vast highways that crisscrossed the American Midwest. The road was my home, the hum of the engine, my lullaby. I was no stranger to the isolation of the open road, the endless landscapes, or the way the world seemed to shrink to the glow of my headlights during those long, solitary hauls. I'd been driving for 20 years, a practical man who didn't spook easy. I had always found a certain comfort in the routine, the steady hum of the engine, the predictable rhythm of mile markers, the familiar crackle of late-night radio, ghost stories and trucker tales. I'd heard them all, phantom hitchhikers, lights in the sky. I'd heard plenty of stories from fellow drivers about strange things seen on the road. Phantom hitchhikers, mysterious lights, and odd figures glimpsed in the fog. I'd nod, smile, and keep driving. But I was a practical man, not easily rattled by tales of the supernatural. It was a crisp autumn night. The kind where the air bites your knuckles. It was late October, and I was hauling a load from Kansas City to Denver. The fields were bare, the harvest done, and the sky was clear except for a sliver of moon. The air was crisp, the fields on either side of the highway already stripped bare by the harvest, and the sky was clear except for a sliver of moon. I'd left Kansas City after sunset, aiming to make Denver by morning. I had left the city after sunset, hoping to make good time through the night. The highway was quiet, just me and my rig. The headlights carving a path through the dark. The highway was almost deserted, and I found myself settling into the familiar trance of night driving, sipping coffee, and humming along to the radio as the miles slipped by. My thermos was half empty, the radio playing some old country tune. Everything felt right until it didn't. Around midnight, I approached an old overpass I'd crossed countless times before. It was just another concrete bridge, nothing special. As my headlights swept up the embankment, I saw a figure standing motionless at the railing, a woman, alone, her long coat swaying in the breeze. A woman alone, silhouetted against the night sky. She wore a long dark coat and her hair was loose, blowing slightly in the breeze. My first thought was that she needed help. A breakdown? A lost traveler? My first reaction was concern. Was she stranded? Was she waiting for someone? I eased off the gas, slowing as I passed under the bridge. I slowed as I passed beneath the bridge, glancing up to get a better look. Her eyes met mine, and I froze. For a brief moment, their eyes met. Her gaze steady and distant, her face pale in the moonlight. There was something in her stare, sorrow, maybe, or something deeper, like she was looking past me, into me. I felt an unexpected chill, a sense of sadness and unease that I couldn't explain. I shook it off, told myself it was nothing. I checked my mirrors as I drove on, half expecting to see her move or wave, but she remained perfectly still, watching the road below. The road stretched on, but her face stayed with me, pale and unblinking. I tried to shake off the strange feeling, telling myself she was probably just a traveler waiting for a ride, or perhaps someone from a nearby farm. I turned up the radio, trying to drown out the unease, but the highway felt different now, heavier, like the night itself was watching. I kept driving, the mile markers ticking by, but my mind wouldn't let go of her. Why was she alone? Why that look? The rational part of me said she was just a person, but my gut disagreed. Something about her wasn't right. An hour later, I approached another overpass, and my heart stopped. I passed another overpass about an hour later, and to my shock, I saw her again. Same woman, same coat, same posture, same coat, same posture, same distant stare. She stood there, unmoving. Her eyes locked on my truck. This time, my heart raced. I knew it was impossible. I knew it was impossible for her to have reached that spot ahead of me, especially since I hadn't seen any vehicles pass, or any side roads that could have allowed her to get there first. No cars had passed me. No exits branched off. She couldn't be there, yet she was. My nerves were on edge now. I gripped the wheel, my knuckles white. I kept glancing in my mirrors, scanning the side of the road, half expecting to see her appear again. Every shadow seemed to hide her shape. I tried to focus on the drive, but every overpass became a source of dread. Some were empty, but then, impossibly, she'd be there again, always in the same spot, always watching. Sometimes they were empty, but sometimes, impossibly, I would see her again, always in the same spot, always watching. Her presence was like a weight, pressing on my chest, stealing my breath. I started questioning myself. The more I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, the less sense it made. Was I tired? Hallucinating? I wondered if I was just exhausted. If my mind was playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. I pushed on, the road blurring into a tunnel of dark. Each overpass loomed like a test, daring me to look up. Would she be there? Would she know me? The rational Jack, the one who laughed at ghost stories, was gone. All that was left was a man afraid of what he'd see next. By dawn, I was a wreck. By the time the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I was shaken and exhausted. I pulled into a truck stop, the neon sign flickering like a beacon. I pulled into a truck stop on the edge of a small town, my hands trembling as I poured myself a cup of coffee. The diner smelled of grease and burnt coffee, but it was a lifeline. I tried to talk myself out of my fear, but the image of the woman on the overpass wouldn't leave me. I sat at the counter, staring into my mug. Her face burned into my mind. I couldn't keep it in. I asked a couple of other drivers if they'd ever seen anything strange on that stretch of highway. Most shrugged, but one guy, an old-timer with a face like worn leather, looked at me funny, and one of them, an older man with a weathered face, nodded slowly and said, "You saw her too, didn't you?" His voice was low, like he didn't want the words to carry. He explained that over the years, many drivers had reported seeing a woman on the overpasses along that route, always at night, always alone. They called her the Watcher, the Lady of the Overpass. Some believed she was connected to a story from decades ago, a local woman who had spent years waiting for someone who never returned. He leaned closer, his eyes sharp, her story woven into the fabric of local legend. Some said she was a ghost, others a memory of loss. Others thought she was simply a symbol of longing or sorrow, a figure who appeared to those who were alone on the road. No one knew her name, but everyone who saw her felt it, a sadness that lingered like fog. I wasn't alone, but that didn't make it better. Knowing others had seen her made it real. And that scared me more than anything. I finished the run to Denver, but I wasn't the same. I became obsessed with finding an explanation. I dug through old newspapers, scoured online forums, asked every driver I met. I searched for old newspaper articles, read through online forums, and listened to every rumor I could find among the trucking community. The stories were all the same. The stories varied, but the details were always eerily similar. A solitary woman, always on the overpass, always at night. She never spoke, never moved, just watched, her presence leaving drivers with a lingering sense of sadness or unease. No one could say for sure who she was or why she appeared. Some said she was tied to a crash decades ago, a woman waiting for a lover who died on that highway. Others thought she was something older, a spirit bound to the road itself. But the encounters always left a mark. I couldn't shake her, even after I finished my delivery and returned home. The memory of that night haunted me. I started taking different routes, adding hours to my trips just to avoid those overpasses. I found myself avoiding that stretch of highway, taking longer routes just to avoid the overpasses. I became more cautious, more aware of the strange and unexplained things that could happen on the road. The road wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where the past could find you. I told my story to other drivers, warning them to trust their instincts and to never ignore the feeling that something isn't right. I'd sit in diners, sharing her story, hoping someone had answers. If you've ever driven alone at night, if you've ever glimpsed something out of the corner of your eye that you couldn't explain, you know how quickly the familiar can turn strange. The highway is freedom. but it's also a graveyard for the lost. The open road is a place of freedom, but it's also a place where the past lingers, where the lonely and the lost might still be waiting for someone to notice them. Every time I close my eyes, I see her standing there, watching. I don't drive at night anymore, not if I can help it. So, the next time you see a figure standing on an overpass, trust your instincts, stay alert, and never, ever look back. The road keeps its secrets, and some of them are waiting for you. Story number 11. I grip the wheel, my palms slick with sweat, as the Colorado highway stretches into the night. Headlights burn in my rearview mirror, too close, too steady, refusing to pass. The road is empty, the mountains looming like silent judges under a starless sky. I've driven thousands of miles, but tonight, something feels wrong, like the air itself is holding a secret. Then the lights flash, sharp and demanding, and my heart lurches. Someone wants me to stop. For as long as I could remember, I'd been the responsible one in our group. I was the one who planned every detail, checked every map, made sure Claire and Marcus had their gear ready. That summer, after our college graduation, we decided to take one last road trip together. We'd dreamed of this for years, a journey from upstate New York to the Grand Canyon, winding through the Midwest's golden fields and the Rockies' jagged peaks. We'd spent weeks mapping out our route, booking campsites and making playlists. It was our last chance to hold on to the freedom of youth before life pulled us apart. We laughed, sang, and chased sunsets. Our car a bubble of joy against the vast American landscape. The first week was perfect. We drove through rolling hills and endless cornfields, stopped at quirky roadside diners, and slept under the stars. Every mile felt like a celebration, each diner a memory etched in greasy burgers and shared stories. Claire's laugh echoed through the car, Marcus's terrible puns kept us groaning, and I felt like the road was ours. But Colorado changed everything. It was somewhere in western Colorado, on a lonely stretch of highway, that things began to go wrong. The sun dipped low, painting the mountains gold, but the air grew heavy, oppressive. We'd left our campsite late, aiming for a small town before nightfall. I was driving, Claire dozing in the back seat, Marcus fiddling with the GPS. I kept glancing at the mirrors, uneasy, though I couldn't say why. Then I saw it. I noticed headlights in the rearview mirror. They weren't just passing lights. They followed us, matching our speed, never closing the gap. As the miles passed, the vehicle stayed behind, never passing, never falling back. My stomach knotted, but I told myself it was nothing. The headlights flashed. My heart skipped a beat. The car behind us, a dark SUV, surged forward, pulling alongside. The driver rolled down his window, gesturing for me to pull over. His face was shadowed, but I saw a uniform, police. I hesitated, unsure what to do. Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "Nat, this doesn't feel right," he said. Marcus leaned forward, his voice tense. "Why would a cop be in an unmarked car out here?" I slowed the car, pulling onto the shoulder, my hands shaking. The gravel crunched under the tires, and I gripped the wheel like it could anchor me. The SUV stopped behind us, its headlights glaring in the mirrors. The driver stepped out, tall and broad, his silhouette cutting through the dusk. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a tactical vest and dark sunglasses. Sunglasses at night? My gut screamed something was wrong. He carried a flashlight, shining it into the car, blinding us. The light burned my eyes, and I squinted, trying to see his face. "License and registration," he said, his voice flat. No emotion, no warmth, just a command. I fumbled for my wallet, my hands trembling. My fingers shook so badly I dropped my ID. Marcus whispered, "Ask for his badge." His voice was barely audible, but it steadied me. "Can I see your badge, officer?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay calm. He didn't move, didn't blink. His expression didn't change. "Just give me your license and registration." The air felt thick, like I was breathing through a mask. Claire sat up in the back seat, her face pale. She hadn't spoken, but her eyes were wide, locked on the man. "Officer, I'd like to call 911 to verify your identity," I said, my voice shaking. My hand reached for my phone. Slow, deliberate, the man's jaw tightened. "Step out of the car now." That was it, the moment I knew. My dad's words echoed in my mind. If you ever feel unsafe during a traffic stop, you have the right to call 911 and stay in the car with the doors locked. I dialed, my fingers clumsy, the phone slipping in my grip. The man's face twisted in anger. He pounded on the window with his flashlight. The glass shook, and Claire gasped, clutching the seat. "Open the door now!" His voice was a snarl, no trace of authority, only threat. I didn't think, I acted. I threw the car into drive, flooring the accelerator. The tires spun, kicking up gravel and we lurched forward. The car shot forward, fishtailing onto the highway while the SUV's lights flared behind us. Chasing, the SUV stayed close, its driver swerving dangerously behind us. The engine's hum was deafening, the headlights blinding in the mirrors. I shouted our location into the receiver, begging for help. The 911 operator's voice was calm, guiding me to a town. Any town. The dispatcher told me to keep driving, to head for a populated area. Marcus yelled directions, his voice cracking as he pointed to a side road. I took a sharp turn onto a side road, the car bouncing over potholes and gravel. The car shuddered, but I didn't slow down. The SUV followed, its headlights looming in the rearview mirror. Claire was crying now, her hands over her face, but I couldn't look back. Every turn felt like a gamble, every mile a test. The road twisted through the dark, the mountains closing in. I didn't know where we were, only that we had to keep moving. Finally, I saw the lights of a small town ahead. They glowed like a beacon, promising safety. I aimed for the first gas station, pulling into the brightly lit lot. The SUV hesitated, its lights dimming, then turned and vanished into the night. We sat in the car, shaking as the police arrived. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, my breath ragged. We described the man, the SUV, the uniform. The officers nodded, their faces grim. One of them said there have been reports of fake cops in the area, people posing as law enforcement to rob travelers. "You did the right thing," he said, but his words felt hollow. The rest of the trip was a blur. We avoided driving at night, sticking to well-traveled roads. Every car behind us felt like a threat, every shadow a reminder. My nerves frayed by the memory of the man's face, his voice. I saw him in my dreams, those sunglasses, that cold stare. The experience changed me. I became more cautious, more skeptical. I questioned every uniform, every authority. I told my story to anyone who would listen, warning them to trust their instincts. Claire and Marcus were different too. They struggled with nightmares, waking to the sound of pounding on glass. We barely spoke of it, but the silence bound us tighter. The open road was supposed to be freedom, but now it felt like a trap. The open road is a place where danger can hide behind a badge. I learned that trust can be a weapon, turned against you in a heartbeat. The scariest dangers are the ones that wear a badge. I drive differently now. My eyes always on the mirrors, my phone always charged, and I wonder, every night, if he's still out there waiting for someone else to stop, someone. Story number 12. I never thought a shadow could feel so heavy. My name is Daniel, a photographer with a heart that beats for the open road. For years, I'd dreamed of a solo journey across America, chasing horizons and capturing the fleeting beauty of forgotten places. My old sedan, packed with camera gear and a dog-eared atlas, was my home on wheels. But that night in the New Mexico desert, the road turned on me, and I learned how quickly freedom can become a fight for survival. The desert was a painting, and I was lost in its colors. The sun dipped low, spilling gold and crimson across the sand. I'd spent the day wandering the skeletal remains of an old mining town, my camera heavy with images of rusted machinery and crumbling adobe, exhausted but alive. I drove deeper into the desert, the highway stretching like a promise under an endless sky. I felt untouchable, wrapped in the solitude I'd always craved, but something was watching. As dusk settled, I pulled into a gravel turnout, a small patch of nothing hidden by scraggly mesquite. I rolled down the windows, letting the cool night air flood the car. My journal lay open on my lap, pen scratching notes about the day's wonders. The silence was a blanket, thick and comforting, broken only by the distant howl of a coyote. I leaned back, eyes heavy, and let the desert lull me into a false sense of peace. Then the night turned sharp. I woke with a jolt, heart hammering in my chest. The darkness was absolute, pressing against the windows like a living thing. My phone glowed 2:13 its screen mocking me with no service. I sat frozen, ears straining for what had pulled me from sleep. The air felt wrong, heavy with a presence I couldn't see. My instincts screamed to move, to run, but I stayed still, clutching the steering wheel like a lifeline. They were already there. A faint scrape, metallic and deliberate, came from beneath the car. My blood turned to ice. I peered through the fogged windows, and there it was, a figure, crouched near my back tire, shrouded in a hooded jacket. In their hands, a glint of metal, sharp and cruel, being laid carefully behind my wheels. Whoever these people were, they were setting a trap. A spike strip, homemade and vicious, meant to shred my tires and leave me stranded. I scanned the shadows, my breath shallow. 2 more figures emerged, one near the front of the car, the other standing watch at the edge of the turnout. I was boxed in, alone miles from help. My mind raced, conjuring images of my family, my sister's laugh, the life I'd built. I wasn't ready to become a ghost story, another name lost to the desert. The first figure moved again, their movements slow and deliberate, like a predator savoring the hunt. I forced myself to think. Staying put meant waiting for them to strike. Driving meant risking the spikes. I needed a way out, something to break their plan. My fingers brushed against the emergency whistle on my keychain, a gift from my sister. A small thing I'd laughed off when she gave it to me. Now, it was my only weapon. I gripped the whistle, took a steadying breath, and blew with everything I had. The piercing sound shattered the night, a scream that echoed across the desert. The figures froze, caught off guard, their heads snapping toward the car. I seized the moment. I turned the key, the engine roaring to life, and slammed the car into reverse. The tires spun, kicking up gravel as I swerved left, praying I'd miss the spikes. The car lurched onto the highway, the rear window shuddering as something heavy struck it. I didn't look back. My foot pressed the accelerator to the floor. The car fishtailing before finding grip on the asphalt. The desert blurred past, my headlights carving a path through the dark. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst, but I kept driving, checking the mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The road stayed empty, a lifeline stretching toward safety. Miles later, I found a gas station, its fluorescent lights a beacon in the night. I stumbled inside, shaking, and poured out my story to the clerk. The police came, but the turnout was empty when they checked. No spikes, no figures. just the desert swallowing its secrets. I spent the rest of the night in the gas station, too shaken to sleep. The weight of what could have happened hit me like a wave. A simple choice to stop had nearly cost me everything. I called my family, my voice breaking as I told them what happened. Mother cried, begging me to come home. My father cursed, angry at a world that could turn so cruel. My sister, the one who gave me the whistle, just listened. Her silence, heavy with relief, was determined to finish my journey, to reclaim the sense of freedom that had always drawn me to the road, but I wasn't the same. The next morning, I had my car checked. A cracked tail light and a few scratches were the only scars. I drove on, but the desert had left its mark. I avoided lonely turnouts, stayed in well-lit places and listened to that small voice in my head that warned when something felt wrong. The road was still my sanctuary, but I understood now how fragile that sanctuary was. Weeks later, in a diner in Texas, I overheard a trucker talking about ghost traps on desert highways, spike strips set by thieves to rob stranded drivers. Daniel's story became a warning he shared with fellow travelers in online forums and coffee shops at campgrounds and truck stops. I started telling my story too, urging others to stay sharp, to trust their gut. The road is freedom, but it's also a place where shadows hide teeth. I think about that night, often, the way the desert turned from a dream to a nightmare in a heartbeat. If you've ever traveled alone, if you've ever felt the hair on the back of your neck stand up for no reason, you know how quickly a peaceful journey can turn into a nightmare. The open road calls, but it demands respect. Trust your instincts, stay alert, and never ignore that feeling that something's not right. My journey didn't end in New Mexico, but it changed me. I finished my trip, my camera filled with images of America's hidden places, but also with a new kind of weight, because sometimes the scariest monsters aren't the ones you see coming. They're the ones that wait in the dark, silent and patient for you to let your guard down. If you've got a story like mine, don't keep it to yourself, share it. Your words could be the warning that saves someone else. And if this tale made your heart race, if it reminded you to stay vigilant, join our community at Verified Fears Horror Stories, subscribe, share, and let's keep each other safe on the road ahead. Every mile is a gift. Don't let it become a trap.